Imagine a crown not as a symbol of power, but as a target painted in gold. On a freezing January morning in 1649, a man who believed he was chosen by God himself to rule the earth stood before a window, looking out at a wooden stage draped in black. This wasn't a coronation, and it wasn't a celebration, it was a scaffold. For centuries, the kings of England were untouchable, shadows of the divine. But in this moment, the shadow was being dragged into the light of a cold, unforgiving sun. The man was King Charles I, and what happened to him over the final days of his life would rewrite the DNA of the modern world through blood and absolute terror. We're taught that history is made of dates and treaties, but the reality is far more visceral, because the fall of Charles wasn't just a political shift, it was a systematic psychological dismantling of a human being who had never been told no. The tension in London was so thick you could feel it in the lungs of every citizen huddled in the narrow, soot-stained streets. A king was on trial for his life, but to Charles, the very idea was a cosmic joke. How do you put a god in the witness box? How do you judge the man who provides the very law you were using to condemn him? As he sat in Westminster Hall, he refused to even remove his hat, because to him there was no authority in that room higher than his own. But while Charles played the part of the stoic martyr, the men across from him were fueled by a desperate, terrifying realization. They knew that if the king lived, they were dead men walking. It was a kill-or-be-killed chess match, where the board was the future of an entire empire. The trial was a masterclass in atmospheric dread. Every time Charles tried to speak, the guards would clatter their weapons to drown him out. The air was filled with the smell of damp stone and the sweat of men who knew they were committing the ultimate sin of regicide. Charles looked at his accusers with a cold, detached pity that infuriated them, because even as a prisoner, he held a psychological leash over his captors. He wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for the very concept of the monarchy itself. He believed that if he broke, the crown broke with him. So he stood his ground while the world outside descended into a fever dream of rumors and betrayal. But the walls were closing in faster than he could have imagined. Behind closed doors, the signatures were being gathered. 59 men were putting pen to paper, effectively signing their own death warrants if they failed to kill the king first. You could hear the scratching of the quills in the silence of the night as the most powerful man in the world was reduced to a set of charges on a piece of parchment. The transition from a ruler of millions to a tyrant, traitor, and murderer was happening in real time, and Charles could do nothing but watch as his divine right was stripped away, layer by agonizing layer. The psychological warfare reached its peak when they brought him back to his chambers, and he realized his children were being brought to say their final goodbyes. This wasn't about politics anymore. It was about the raw, unfiltered agony of a father looking into the eyes of his children, knowing he would be a headless ghost by morning. He told his young son not to let them make him a king while his brothers lived, and the weight of that request hung in the air like a physical shroud. The king was dead in spirit long before the axe ever touched his neck. He spent his final night listening to the sound of the hammers. Every strike of metal on wood was a nail in his coffin as the scaffold was built just outside his window. He didn't sleep because the sound of his own death being constructed was too loud to ignore. He asked for 2 shirts because he didn't want the crowd to see him shiver in the cold and mistake it for fear. Even at the edge of the abyss, the image of the king had to remain perfect.
The rhythmic thud of the hammer against the wood echoed through the stone corridors of St. James's Palace like a heartbeat counting down to 0. Every strike was a reminder that the world King Charles I had known, a world of silk, incense, and the unquestioned authority of the bloodline, was being dismantled piece by piece just outside his window. He spent his final hours not in a palace, but in a vacuum of silence, broken only by those hammers. There is a specific kind of torture in hearing the construction of your own death. It is a slow psychological erosion that strips away the ego until only the raw human remains. Charles knew that by dawn, the man who owned the land, the trees, and the very air people breathed would be nothing more than a logistical problem for a group of nervous soldiers. As the sun began to rise on January 30th, the frost was so thick it looked like the earth itself had turned to bone. Charles dressed with a haunting level of precision. He put on 2 shirts, as he had planned, because he knew the winter wind would be biting, and he refused to let his enemies see his body tremble. To the crowd, a shiver was a sign of a coward, but to Charles, a king must be a statue of ice, even when the fire is at his feet. He walked through St. James's Park, surrounded by a forest of steel. 1,200 soldiers lined the path, their armor dull in the gray light, and the only sound was the crunch of frozen grass beneath his boots. He walked fast, so fast the guards struggled to keep up, as if he were chasing his own fate rather than being dragged toward it. When he reached Whitehall, he was kept waiting for hours. This was the final twist of the knife. The men in charge were paralyzed by the enormity of what they were about to do. They were about to kill a king, which in the 17th century was equivalent to trying to murder the sun. The tension behind the scenes was a chaotic mess of legal panic and spiritual dread. While Charles ate a small piece of bread and drank a glass of wine, the men who had condemned him were frantically trying to find an executioner. No one wanted the job. To touch the king's neck with an axe was to invite a curse that would last for generations. They had to find a man willing to wear a mask and a wig to hide his identity, because to be known as the regicide was a death sentence of its own.
Eventually, the door opened and the walk began. Charles was led through the banqueting house, passing under the magnificent ceiling painted by Rubens, a ceiling he had commissioned to celebrate the divine power of his father. He looked up at the images of kings being crowned by angels while he walked toward a hole cut directly through the wall. They had literally broken the palace to lead him to the scaffold. As he stepped out onto the black-draped stage, the sight was enough to stop the heart of any witness. Thousands of people were packed into the streets, but there was a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped breathing. Charles looked down at the block. It was unusually low, only a few inches off the ground. It was designed this way so that if he resisted, they could drag him down and pin him like an animal. This was the ultimate humiliation. The King of England was expected to kneel in the dirt like a common criminal. He looked at the executioner, who stood there in his grotesque disguise, and then he looked at the crowd. He wanted to speak, but his voice could only reach the soldiers and the few people on the stage. He told them he was the martyr of the people, but his words were lost to the wind. He was a man talking to a history books while his physical body was seconds away from being erased. He took off his George, the jeweled insignia of the Order of the Garter, and handed it to the bishop with a single word that has haunted historians for centuries: remember. He tucked his hair into a white satin nightcap so the axe would have a clear path. He didn't want the executioner to struggle. He wanted it to be clean. He knelt down and placed his head on that low, humiliating block, and for a moment the only thing he could see was the grain of the wood and the shadow of the man standing over him. He told the executioner he would pray for a moment, and when he stretched out his hands, that would be the signal. The air was frozen. The crowd was a sea of wide eyes and pale faces. Charles I, the King of England, stretched out his hands, and the shadow of the axe began its descent. The axe fell with a sound that those present described not as a strike, but as a sickening, heavy thud that resonated through the very cobblestones of London. In that split second, the spell of 1,000 years was broken. The head of the king, the supposed representative of God on earth, rolled across the black cloth of the scaffold. A masked man reached down, gripped the hair of the fallen monarch, and hoisted the severed head into the winter air. "Behold the head of a traitor!" he shouted. But the response wasn't a cheer. It was a sound far more terrifying. A collective, low, guttural groan rose from the thousands of spectators, a sound of visceral horror, as if the entire nation had just realized they had committed a sin from which there was no turning back. People rushed forward, not to celebrate, but to dip their handkerchiefs in the king's blood. In their minds, the blood was still holy, a relic that could heal the sick or protect the faithful. The soldiers struggled to push them back as the scene devolved into a chaotic scramble for the physical remains of a legend. But while the crowds fought for scraps of fabric, the men who had orchestrated the execution were already moving to erase Charles from the physical world. They didn't want a shrine. They didn't want a monument. They wanted him gone. The body was quickly placed in a plain coffin, and the head was crudely sewn back onto the neck by a surgeon, a final macabre stitch to hold together the broken image of the monarchy. Charles was buried in a hurry at Windsor, hidden away in the same vault as Henry VIII, with no grand ceremony and no public mourning. The government even refused to let his supporters put an inscription on his tomb. They wanted him to be a ghost with no name. For 11 years, England lived in the shadow of that empty throne, a republic born of blood and iron, led by Oliver Cromwell. The world watched in stunned silence as the British Isles experimented with a life without a king, but the ghost of Charles I was never truly laid to rest. The image of that man in the two shirts, standing tall against the winter wind, became a symbol that the new regime couldn't kill. The final twist in this dark chapter of history came years later, when the tide turned and the monarchy was restored. The men who had signed Charles's death warrant, those who were still alive, were hunted down like animals. But for those who had already died, including Cromwell himself, the vengeance was even more symbolic. Their bodies were exhumed, dragged through the streets, and hanged in chains. The head of Cromwell was placed on a spike outside the very hall where Charles had been tried. It was a grim, symmetrical revenge that proved one thing: you can kill a man, but you cannot kill the story he leaves behind. Today, if you walk past the banqueting house in London, you can still see the spot where the scaffold stood. There is a small bust of Charles I above the entrance, looking out over the street where his life ended. History remembers him not for how he ruled, but for how he died. He transformed himself from a failed politician into a tragic icon of the divine right, proving that the most powerful thing a king can do is lose his head with dignity. The trial of Charles I wasn't just the end of a life, it was the birth of the modern world, a world where no leader, no matter how powerful, is above the law. The blood on that scaffold washed away the old world and left behind a question that we are still answering today: who truly holds the power?